It's no secret that Bill Gates is a genius.
I wonder if you've ever had this measured. What is your IQ?
When I was very young, I took some tests and I did well. I'm good at tests.
And it's also no secret that Bill Gates reads a lot.
I read a lot. There were always contests at the library in the summer where, if you read 10 books, you got a little gold star. If you read 20, you got like 2. And there were like 5 or 6 girls and I that would always read like 35 books, and we'd see, who could do the most.
So we all know how powerful reading books can be. It's pretty much all that anyone ever talks about. What I found though was that it doesn't just matter if you're reading the book. What matters just as much is how you read the book. And if you're reading books in the wrong way, then you're missing a lot of benefit, and you could even be just wasting all of your time. So this video is going to reveal exactly how Bill Gates thinks is the most efficient way to read, as well as everything I've learned since applying Bill Gates' way to reading, as well as some motivation if you haven't started reading yet. And then finally, I'll end the video right at the end with a full list of every single book that Bill Gates has ever recommended. The first point is Bill Gates' note-taking method when he's reading.
When you're reading, you have to be careful that you really are concentrating, particularly if it's a non-fiction book. Are you taking the new knowledge and sort of attaching it to the knowledge you have? And for me, taking notes helps make sure that I'm really thinking hard about what's in there.
So when you're reading a book, you shouldn't just be reading the book to memorize what it says. You should be reading the book to absorb all of the information that's in there, to let you make changes in your life, and to kind of have that information percolate throughout your identity so that you end up becoming a better version of yourself after you've read that book. And there's 2 different ways that you can learn. One of them is called maintenance rehearsal, and one of them is called elaborative rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal is where you try and download pieces of information in your brain through repetition. So this is what you would have done if you were studying for a history test. You'd remember a date, you'd repeat it to yourself again and again and again, so that when it came to the essay or the test, you were able to recall that information and put it into the essay. The problem with this is the way I like to view it is that kind of information is stored in a bubble in your mind in its own separate place. It's just a piece of memory, it's not integrated with all different parts of your brain. On the other side is elaborative rehearsal, which is when you read something, you make connections with that piece of information to other parts of your brain. You hook that old information onto this new information so that it kind of integrates itself into your brain. And this is completely real. You can even Google maintenance rehearsal versus elaborative rehearsal. And when you do elaborative rehearsal, what that's going to do is you're going to be able to effortlessly memorize these pieces of information, because not only are you just memorizing it as if it was an external bubble, you're fully integrating it into who you are. You're making so many connections that your brain just remembers that piece of information because it fits in with your paradigm or the way that you view the world, and this is completely scientifically proven. And when you take notes in the margins of a book, just like Bill Gates recommended, you're stimulating the parts of the brain that go alongside elaborative rehearsal, which means that by taking notes and asking yourself the question, how can I apply this to my life? You're not just reading the information to remember it. Like I said, you're integrating it into who you are so that you start making decisions effortlessly, differently, because you now see the world differently. And that information percolates and embeds itself inside of your identity so that you are a different person. It's kind of like you're taking a building block, just like Lego, of this piece of information, and you're slotting it into yourself. You're not having to force it down, and it's not a building block that's floating in the space like I was talking about before with the history exam. You're slotting it into yourself so that effortlessly it's part of who you are, and you can start to make better decisions and become a better person just from taking notes in the margins and truly absorbing that information. And then whenever you're taking these notes and you stumble across a aha moment where you finally have a realization about something you could be doing better, then you want to store that aha moment into some kind of a journal. I use Notion or whatever note-taking system you use. So you're basically writing notes in the margins of the journal or the margins of the book to stimulate new ideas and embed it into yourself. And then when you come across a building block that slots into your brain perfectly, then you can store that away so that you never forget it. Now, does Bill Gates read paper books or ebooks like a Kindle?
Over time, I will make the switch, but when I'm just sitting there at night reading, often a paper magazine or the book, I'm used to that. And it's ridiculous because I have this whole book bag that goes on my trips with me, and it's voluminous and antiquated.
And then the next thing is, how can you even decide what kinds of books you should be reading?
If you want to learn science, reading the history of scientists and the story of scientists about when they were confused and what tools or insights allowed them to make the progress they make. So you have the timeline, or you have the map, or you have the branches of science and what's known and what's not known. So incremental knowledge is so much easier to maintain in a rich way than, the first time, somebody, is telling you about Rome. Why am I reading about Rome?
And whilst he's not very clear in that clip, what I think he's referring to is the difference between JIT and JIC, which are both business inventory strategies. And the best examples of this I can think are Ford versus Toyota. So what Ford used to do was the just-in-case business methodology, where they would have all of these different colors of car ready in all of the different models and all of the different types, so that if someone made an order, they would have it ready to ship out. Now the downside of that is you have to have a whole lot of inventory. You have to have so many different combinations of type and color and model so that when someone orders, you're able to ship it out straight away. Now the downside of having so much inventory is it's quite expensive to keep. The more inventory you have, the greater the storage area has to be, which means that the more expensive it is to keep all of that stock. Then what Toyota started to do was the just-in-time methodology, where they would have all of the pieces ready in their distributors, and whenever someone ordered, they would order all of the pieces for the car ready and make it on demand, which is the just-in-time methodology. Instead of having all of the cars just in case, which took up a lot of storage and was expensive, they made the cars on demand, which meant that they only had to keep the storage of a very limited amount, which was the cheaper methodology, and it ended up giving them a lot of benefit. The point being in telling you this is that you shouldn't read books that you might need in the future. You should read books of a problem that you're having right now in the moment, or at least I think that's what Bill Gates is trying to say. And I see this happen in business all of the time. People watch YouTube videos and buy courses over problems that they're not having in the moment. So people will learn about Facebook advertising because maybe 2 years in the future, they're going to learn about Facebook advertising and they're going to use it in the future. Instead, learn about something else, about a problem you're having at the moment, and then in 2 years' time, if you do decide to do Facebook advertising, that's when you start learning about it. Which means instead of wasting your time about something you could use in the future, which would be the just-in-case methodology, you learn stuff about specific problems that you're having at the moment, which helps you progress, incremental progress over the problems you're having, which is the just-in-time methodology. Now, later on in this video, I'm going to make a counter-argument to this, why I humbly believe that this isn't true all of the time, but before that, I think it's important to answer the question of, does Bill Gates read the first chapter, then finish the book, or does he make sure that he finishes every single book that he starts?
I don't let myself start a book that I'm not going to finish.
If you decide to finish every single book that you start, it puts a lot of pressure on making sure that the book you're picking is the correct book. So I came up with a short framework that you can use to help you make that decision, because life is all about reducing the amount of decisions you make and creating systems or principles that help you make those decisions effortlessly and flawlessly. So after I heard Bill Gates talking about this, the way that I started reading books was, first of all, I would think about a problem that I was facing. Second of all, I would think of other people who had solved that problem. Third of all, I would read any books that they've read, or I would look for recommendations that that person recommends reading. I would read those books, and chances are, if it worked for them, it's also going to work for me. So an example of this is I've always been quite driven, or not always. I've recently in the past few years become very driven, but not quite as driven as I'd like to be. I wanted to become relentless. So I asked myself this question: what problem am I having? The answer would be, I want to become relentless. Then I thought, what other people have solved this problem? And the obvious example was someone like Kobe Bryant, who just come to the top of his field. Then I asked myself the question, right, has he written any books on becoming relentless? No, he hasn't, but what books does he recommend? Then I stumbled across a book called Relentless by Tim Grover, who was actually Kobe Bryant's coach, revealing everything that Kobe Bryant had taught him on how to become relentless. So I went ahead, read that book, and it solved that problem for me. Just like the metaphor I was using before, I took that piece of Lego, I ingrained it in my brain, and because I was taking notes in the margin, it automatically ingrained itself in me, and straight away after reading that book, I found myself becoming a lot more motivated, a lot more driven, and ultimately a lot more relentless. Now, going back to what I was talking about earlier, between the argument between just-in-time information and just-in-case information, where I think Bill Gates was trying to say that most of the time you should be doing just-in-time information, and I completely agree with that. But there's definitely a time for exception, where just-in-case books are definitely recommended. So there are some things that you know, for example, tying your shoelaces. There are other things that you don't know, for example, rocket science. Then there are other things that you don't know that you know, and an example would be reading microfacial expressions in other humans. You know, you can do this in practice, but you probably don't know the theory behind it. Then finally, there are things that you don't know that you don't know. And this is the most difficult one to give examples for, because you don't know that you don't know that thing. And that's where I believe that just-in-case books can sometimes be of benefit, because they teach you things that you don't know that they don't know. A couple examples of this is Principles, which is a great book. There's going to be a link down in the description for that. And another great book is the Bible. And even if you're not religious, you can learn a lot from those things. The point being, you don't know that you have the problem that they give you the solution for. But when you read them, you recognize that you have this problem and that solution also works. So sometimes just-in-case books like Principles and like the Bible can actually be a lot of benefit to you. So before I give you all of Bill Gates' book recommendations ever, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I know this was kind of my take on what Bill Gates was saying, but there's very little information out there on what Bill Gates actually does. If you've enjoyed this video, then make sure you click the like button. It really helps me out. It boosts this video in the YouTube algorithm, which means more people will see it. Thank you so much. I deeply appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video.